Hey guys, so today I'm going to be talking about research methodology and ethics, which is chapter 7 of the Conan Foster book. So according to the APA manual, the 3 elements of the methods section include participants or subjects, apparatus used, and the procedure. However, Conan Foster described 3 other subsections that should be discussed in the methods section if it is relevant. And all of these subsections should be organized chronologically so that it just makes sense. So the first subsection is design. The APA manual suggests that a design section should be 1 or 2 paragraphs before the methods section. However, Conan Foster suggests describing the design right before the methods section or within the methods section is appropriate because the nature of design influences the rest of the methods section. So again, it's wherever it makes the most sense for your particular research. So regardless of where your design subsection is, you have to indicate whether it's a within or between participants approach, the general class of the design, such as if it's experimental or correlational, and more specific details such as two-group or survey research, and also what you plan to do with your design. And more examples can be found on page 129 of the Conan Foster book. So part 2 of the methods section is talking about participants. In this subsection, you'll answer 3 questions. Who will participate, how many will participate, and how will they be selected? In this subsection, you'll talk about the gender, age, race, ethnicity, geographic area, socioeconomic status, where you got the participants, such as at a college setting or in a classroom. And depending on your study, other information such as IQ scores, sexual orientation, or diagnosis should also be discussed. Particularly important information has to do with participant characteristics that could provide alternative explanations for your anticipated results or be inadvertently confounded with your independent variable. In this section, you'll also describe how you obtain the participants' information, such as using a questionnaire. You should provide a copy of the questionnaire in the appendix. Finally, you'll identify how many participants you'll need for the study. One way to figure this out is by referring to the analyses you'll be using. Most analyses have a rule of thumb estimating the minimum participants to variables ratios required to yield a stable finding. Another way is to determine the power. Power analyses allow you to determine how many participants you will need to detect either a small, medium, and large effect. Power refers to the likelihood the statistics you use can detect the effects of the independent variable. It's a function of 3 things: your sample size, the magnitude of the effects of your independent variables, and the alpha level. So the next section is setting and apparatus. So here you'll describe the general setting of where your research will take place. In a controlled experiment, you have to be very specific and mention things such as the square foot of the room. But if it's not a controlled experiment, you don't really have to describe the room per se into that much detail. And if a certain piece of apparatus is used specifically for your research, it should be described here in great detail and even include directions on how to operate it. The next section, which the APA manual doesn't suggest to put in the methods section, is the independent variables, but Cohen and Foster did, and they said to describe two things, how you will operationalize or define and measure your independent variables, and how you will ensure the integrity of these variables. So that second point involves manipulation checks of their experimenters' behaviors to ensure that they are doing what they're supposed to do. So the experimenter should be unaware of the experimental hypotheses. So that's usually not you. Usually you have to hire somebody or get an undergrad student to do it for extra credit or something like that. So along with your independent variables come your dependent variables or your measures. In this subsection, you'll give details about the data collection devices that you'll use. You'll obviously provide the name of that instrument, the author, and the publication date. You're gonna paraphrase the instructions, the test stimuli, and the response alternatives given. If it's a relatively well-known instrument, you don't really have to give too much detail. If not, then you should detail what it is. And if you're not really sure, you should contact your chairperson. And you'll also talk about how the measure will be scored and why this dependent variable is appropriate to use for your study. Something that's very important is making sure that you have permission to give the details. Some tests can't be publicly available for test security reasons. And finally, you have your procedures where you'll describe the actual steps you're going to take to obtain the data from your participants. And you'll walk the reader through the process just as the participant would experience it. So finally, I'm going to be talking about ethics. It is a very good idea to familiarize yourself with ethical guidelines that we all use by reading the ethics code, and that really helps you determine if your research is ethical and safe for everyone involved and yourself. So a part of being ethical includes providing informed consent forms as well as assent forms. Pages 147 through 153 provide very good samples of consent forms for adults and parental consent forms, as well as assent forms for adolescents and children. So consent forms include what your research is studying and how they're going to study it and why they're going to study it, as well as information about the duration of the research and what participation includes, including the risk and benefits, as well as confidentiality and compensation for participation. So just because you know that your research is ethical doesn't mean that you can just go on and do it. You have to know the operation of your local institutional review board, or IRB. A lot of IRB meetings are only held monthly, so you have to be aware of the deadlines so that you can use your time efficiently and you're not waiting a whole another month so that you can be approved. And finally, just because you get approval from the IRB in the beginning doesn't mean that you can just suddenly act unethical. You have to maintain ethical procedures throughout your entire study from beginning to end.